Hi everybody, Arabel here with Pivoting in Heels. Have a really exciting interview that's about to come up. It's with Valerie Jarrett. Valerie Jarrett was the senior advisor to President Obama, apart from having so many incredible positions here in Chicago. So she's going to be with us. She just finished writing a book called Finding My Voice. And I would love to encourage all of you to go out and get it. It's a great read. It gives you a lot of insight into her life, some of the major pivots that she's had, some of them really difficult, and how she's handled them. And really, you're going to get an insight into how she's grown as an individual, as a leader. And wait till you hear all the things that she's got coming up in her life. So stay with us. We're about to have Valerie Jarrett join us. I'm really excited about it, and make sure that you get the book. The conversation. So why don't we share for our audience so that they know, because I didn't know that you weren't born in Chicago. So share how that happened.
So I was born in a small town of Shirazi, Iran, in 1956. And in 1954-55, my dad, who was a physician, was looking for a job in the United States. And he could not find one at an academic teaching hospital, which is what he wanted to do. He wanted to do research. And as an African American, the opportunities were not there. And so he and my mom, who were pretty adventuresome spirits, decided to look outside of the United States. And he was offered a job chairing the Department of Pathology and helping start a new hospital in this faraway land, Shirazi, Iran. And my parents knew nothing about the country or the government. It did have stronger diplomatic ties to the United States, obviously, than it has today. But it was really going halfway across the world for an opportunity that was not available to him right here at home. And I was the second baby born in the hospital, the Namazi hospital that my dad helped start. I always say they practiced on some other baby first. And then along came Valerie. And we lived there until I was 5. And from there, he was recruited to continue his research at the London School, University College of London, Galton Labs. And from there, the dean of the University of Chicago Medical Center, a year later, saw his research and offered him a job at the University of Chicago. And so for my mom, this was home. And so off we went back to Chicago for them. And it was like going to a foreign country for me.
Right.
And so it was an interesting way to start out, because at the same time as I was going to excellent schools with young people from all over the world in Shiraz, Iran, Ruby Bridges was integrating her public school in Louisiana right here, surrounded by armed guards. And so there was a kind of a contrast between the life I knew, where my parents took me over the color line, and what was going on in the United States in the middle of the Civil Rights era.
So that was a major pivot in you.
That was my first big pivot.
Major
yes.
pivot, right? And for your family too. I mean, because those were major changes that they ended up having to go through. And let me ask you, because there's another piece to that, right? So you're now in Chicago. There's all this racial tension. Did you feel or know about the difference in races when you were growing up, when you were little?
No, and it's actually one of the reasons my parents wanted to move back to Chicago, is they thought it was very hard to raise a child with a black identity when we were the only black people anywhere to be found in Shiraz. And my mom, I was very close with her family, and she thought it would be important, since I didn't have siblings, for me to feel a part of a community. And part of that definition was being part of the African American community in Chicago, a community that my grandmother and my grandfather had been a big part of long before I was born.
But that led to many difficulties for you, right?
Yes,
it wasn't easy for you, because you came here and then you talk about being bullied when you were very young, and for many different reasons.
Yes.
But part of it was because you were light-skinned.
That's right.
And you had to go through many things. So in retrospect, I'm curious, major pivot in your life that really a lot of the decision was made by your mom. Do you think those decisions would you make those same decisions if you were put in those same situations? And why?
Yeah, I would. I think, well, because part of what we were also experiencing in Iran is a country that was wedded to the caste system. And my mother was unhappy with the way I was beginning to behave towards my babysitter or housekeeper, or She caught me kicking her once, and she just thought was totally unacceptable. Right. But in the culture in Iran, that was okay. And so she was worried, like, how am I going to instill in her the values that I care about, of course, decency and treating people with respect, when I'm in a country where there is a hierarchy. And so I think my parents probably realized it was going to be a bit of a culture shock to me, but they thought it was good for me to experience that at a young age and see that I could overcome it. And I did start out feeling very different, and I wanted to be just like all the other kids, and so I lost that British accent I had developed, and I stopped speaking Farsi, and I rarely talked about where I was born when I was young. But now what I appreciate in retrospect was that all of that is who I am. It's my story, and we are our stories. And so I encourage young people to talk about their life and share it with people, because it leads to a better understanding.
I think also what I really loved is your mother's intent.
Yes.
Although she knew they were also going to go through some major difficult changes, and I perceived from the book that she also understood that you were going to as well, but her intent was for the right purposes.
Absolutely.
And I think us as moms, that's what we're all about. We have the best intention for our kids. And I thought she'd made the right decision in the long run too. I felt bad for you in the book because you went through some
tough,
difficult.
But you know what? I got through it, and I think that's part of the life lesson. Is nobody said life is easy. The question is, when you have challenges, when you face adversity, are you able to bounce back? And I think she thought it was important for me to learn that I could adjust to new situations. And we traveled extensively when I was a child. My parents took me all through Africa and Mexico, and my mother wanted me to be resilient, and she wanted me to be able to get along with people of all walks of life from all parts of the world and find what I had in common with them. And so sometimes that makes you uncomfortable, the way it was when I started in my public school in Chicago. But ultimately you find that you're okay being a little uncomfortable, and it leads to being comfortable when it becomes familiar. Everything is uncomfortable when it's new,
and you grow from that.
You
right?
do grow.
I think putting ourselves sometimes in situations that are there for our growth, they may be difficult, but they help us in the long run. So let's talk a little bit about fast forward, because I loved the whole concept that you had of your 10-year plan.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about your 10-year plan, and I'm curious if you would advise women now, because you had it spelled out.
I sure did.
Year per year, you wanted to get married before the age of 30, and there were certain things that you wanted to achieve, and you achieved all of them, and especially also being in a big law firm and being pretty successful there. But then you find emptiness. You have all these check marks. So let's talk a little bit about that and how you would do that maybe now a little bit differently.
Well, I thought when I was coming out of college, everybody had a plan, and so I thought, well, I needed a plan too. And so I really made it up, and it was just go right to law school, find my passion in the practice of law, get married, have a baby, live happily ever after. And I was off on that plan, a very straight line, and I was craving the comfort of the straight line as opposed to embracing the adventure of the zigzag, which I learned later. And it took me being miserable both at my work and in my personal life, with a new baby staring up at me, expecting me to take care of her, that I finally kind of snapped out of it, and I said, you better listen to the most important voice, and that's the quiet one inside of you. And that's what drove me to public service. And I felt as though I would be a part of something bigger and more important than myself. Harold Washington had just been reelected to the second term as mayor of Chicago, our first African-American mayor, and I had knocked on doors for his campaign, so I was a huge supporter. But I found him just to be so inclusive and engaging, and his vision for Chicago was one I believed in, and I had seen from my own experience and the stories of my mom and my grandmother that Chicago wasn't always a city that was inclusive, where everybody felt they had a seat at the table. And I thought I could use the experience that I'd had.
We're still going through a lot of things here, so
well, we surely are.
Yeah, and our country is actually.
We surely are. But what I thought I could do was be that voice for the people who didn't have a voice, who didn't have a seat at the table, and do it from the inside of government, and feel as though I was giving back and making the city a little bit better than I found it. And you're right, we still have huge challenges here, but I think those challenges are within our reach if good citizens of Chicago participate. And I wanted to be that person.
Tell me what helped you trust that voice, because there's a period in life, and a lot of us have gone through that, right, where we hear that voice, but we don't trust it. And
I ignored it for a while. I ignored it there was something in me that said maybe this isn't the right marriage, but he looked really good on paper, and so I didn't trust it then. And I thought having a baby would make the marriage better, even though everybody tells you it won't. And so I didn't trust it then. And I stayed at the law firm long after I really questioned whether it was a place where I could thrive. And finally, I think, honestly, out of misery, when I was sufficiently miserable, that was a great motivator to change. And I thought to myself, and I had a really good friend who reinforced it, he said, look, worst thing that happens is you don't like it. You can always go back to the law firm. You have a safety net. You have the good fortune of having a safety net. And so why not take this leap of faith and give it a whirl? And I thought that resonated with me.
So do you advise women, because some of these major pivots that you take, they're scary, right? I'm sure there was fear in you sometimes. I know I've gone through it and walked through it. And do you advise women to try to figure out how to set up some sort of a safety net? Not all of them obviously will have the education. I mean, I went to law school too. I have backups, but
yes, it's very helpful when you have a safety net. Yeah. And if you don't have one that you can rely on, that you can produce for yourself, like practicing law, then look around you and say, well, what support network do I have if things don't work out? I was fortunate also that I had parents who were very engaged in my life and that of my daughter. And I had resources, and unfortunately, there are so many working families that don't. They're worrying about, if I change jobs and it doesn't work out, how am I going to feed my family? And that was not my problem. And so my advice is not for those folks who don't have a voice. For those people, the rest of us need to be speaking up.
Exactly.
And using our voices. And when I did work in the White House, I chaired the White House Council on Women and Girls, and top of my agenda was thinking about those working families that are earning a minimum wage, working a double shift to bring home enough money to make ends meet, worried about, I'm one illness away of something devastating happening to my family because I don't have health insurance. So, but if you are in a position, then don't be your own worst enemy.
Right.
Be brave. And brave is not the absence of fear. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's in the face of it, doing it anyway.
And I think, I know for myself, and what I read about you in the book also is when you tend to do things for other people for the greater good, you tend to find that strength. And it's interesting because it also ends up opening your eyes and opening doors that you didn't even know were there. And the other thing is asking for help. Sometimes I know that a lot of times we're afraid to ask for help or embarrassed or whatever.
It makes us vulnerable.
Right.
And I know I was pretending to myself and to everybody around me, I've got this. I'm superhuman. I have supernatural powers that will allow me to be a super lawyer and a super spouse and a super mom and have 100 balls up in the air and none of them will drop.
Right.
Or so I pretended. And of course, they're dropping all over the place.
And they drop all at the same time.
And then I'm telling everybody else, no, there's nothing happening here. It's okay. I've got this. And I didn't. And it was when I finally started to ask for help, and I started with my mom, and she's like, "What's wrong with you? We're right here.
Right.
Why don't you lean on us a little bit?"
Right.
But I thought that made me less competent, and I was busy trying to prove my competency. And I think a lot of young people, you need to get over yourself. You're not superhuman, and it's okay to be a little vulnerable, and it's okay to open up to your friends because then you're going to find out they have secrets too.
Right.
And they're just as scared as you are.
Which is why we're sharing this with everybody, because we all have things we've been through. We all have some secrets. We all have issues that we have to deal with. And I think that it's more courageous to ask for help,
yes,
and to share some things. And you end up opening doors that, again, you didn't even know were there. So tell me, fast forward, I'm so curious. There you are. You're at the White House now, right? You are with the leader of our country, and side by side, and by then I think you had really found your voice. How and did you encourage other women to do so, the women that were involved with the administration?
Well, because I had a mentor when I worked in local government named Lucille, who was so supportive of me and got me to open up and tell her my story. And as a result of that, she cared about me and she invested in me. She mentored me. She advocated for me. She made a huge difference in my life. And so when I was in a position to do that for younger women, I made up my mind I wanted to be just like Lucille and make life easier for those who hadn't found their voice yet, and encourage them and mentor them and lobby for them when they're not in the room. And so with both my position when I was CEO of a real estate company, the Habitat company, and then also certainly working in the White House, I really gravitated towards younger women to help nurture them and help them kind of avoid some of the mistakes I made when I was younger, and encourage them to discover the power of their voices. Give them the sense of empowerment that they could use their voices to be a force for good. And nothing gives me more pride and delight now than when I see these women who've now matured and they're badasses on their own, and to see that kind of evolution, natural evolution, and know that perhaps I had a part in helping it not be quite so painful as it might have been without me there.
Well, because it's tough. I mean, even though you got some of the most brilliant women, very well educated, have done a lot in their life, I mean, then they're thrown into a room, and there's a lot of men that are also very aggressive and everything, and want the president to hear them, right?
Yes.
They're the ones that are always right, and nobody else is. So did that always work out where the women were able to get their ideas across?
No, not at first. At first, in fact, I noticed that their voices were shrinking. But when I brought it to President Obama's attention, he just hopped on it because he said, look, we are creating a culture here. And people tend to bring their prior experiences to the table, to a new table, and nobody knew him that well. The women didn't. Several of the men had worked with him in the campaign, but the women didn't. And so they didn't appreciate he was raised by a single mom, that he had a grandmother who worked long before most women were working, and in a bank where she trained people, men who leapfrogged over her, and he's married to this extraordinarily successful wife, and he has 2 daughters. And so you have him with a low when you say, we want to build a culture that's inclusive. And so his comment to the women when he brought them all together was, look, this is the White House. It's high stress, high wire, high stakes, and I need your voices because I'll make better decisions if I'm informed by your input. And that was empowering. In a sense, it gave them permission to speak up because they weren't doing it for themselves. They were doing it for him.
Yes.
And somehow I think for women that's a little bit easier. But I also encourage them to speak up for themselves because it's good practice to get used to using your voice and to realize that you have great ideas and you have amazing expertise and you have a unique perspective, and it matters and it counts, and you have to fight for it.
You caused a major pivot, I think, there then in the White House for those women, right?
Yes.
I mean, I think that's very, very important. And I think we have to encourage other women because this country needs our voice.
It does, and there's also safety in numbers, because let's face it, oftentimes those of us who are in male-dominated fields, you look around and you're the only one. And it's harder to speak up when you don't see somebody that looks like you around the table. But in the White House,
I'm in the technology field, so it's very
it's totally male-dominated,
sure,
right?
Sure.
But our good fortune is President Obama created a White House where half of our department heads were women. And then we started having dinner on our own. And so we would share our stories with one another. And when you go into a meeting and you see somebody across the table who you just had dinner with the night before, you feel a little bit more confident speaking up. You know they have your back. And I think that's part of it too. Do you feel like you have a support network? So if you do speak up, you're not going to be left hanging out there by yourself. Somebody's going to go, yeah, I agree with Valerie, or yeah, I agree with Cecilia.
Yeah, I always talk about building teams.
Yes.
For me, my closest team is my family, like yours as well. But I have a lot of girlfriends, and they're in different areas as well. And you have to support yourself, and your team is there for you. You know, that's when they're there for you. You know that they're part of your team in a strong way, and you have to. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
What
a pleasure this has been.
This was fun.
Thank you for having me.
It was so good to have you.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.